Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for staying. I see we're down to the hardcore of the audience now. I did think, we have got the biggest panel. There's 8 of us on the panel, but at least there are more of us in the audience than on the stage. I can see there's already some questions coming in, so thank you very much for posting those through Pigeonhole. I know towards the end of the afternoon that sometimes your batteries will be running out in your smartphones, but we will also take questions from the floor, so please be thinking about those as we go on. Last time I was in this room, the Rolling Stones were playing, and there were lots of hands in the air, so I know you can do it, so please be ready and ask some questions. So we're already down to 54 minutes out of our hour, and we have a very distinguished panel here, and I'll let each of them introduce you. I'm sure you've already seen the background, the biogs of the speakers on your handouts on your table, so I won't go in a lot of detail, other than to say we've got a very distinguished panel. This is Singapore International Energy Week and a Singapore Energy Summit, and we have people, I think, representing just about every single part of the world, and a mixture of doctors and a Lord as well. Welcome, Lord Mogg, to really take us through this session. So this session is on maximising the potential of renewables, and I'm going to invite everybody to give a 4 to 5 minute introduction on their view as to how they see us maximising the role of renewables. I would like, hopefully we can cover during the introductions kind of, what role can renewable energy play as part of the mix? What proportion of electricity can be generated by renewables? We see lots of statements from governments, people saying, 20% by 2020. New Zealand is already at 75%, so we look forward to hearing about that. And also maybe we can touch on some of the sectors where people see some of the biggest opportunities, whether it's residential, industrial, transport, and hopefully we can give some examples. And what I'd like us to really get out of this session is any recommendations that the panel can give, practical recommendations as to what role can Singapore play, and more widely, what role can Southeast Asia play in the renewable sector. So hopefully we'll get some takeaways. So with that, I'd like to start from your right and my left, Dr. Arvizu, and to make your introductory comments, please.
Great, thank you, Tim. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And this late in the afternoon, I guess it's time to be a little provocative, so maybe we'll start with some of that.
Please do.
So a couple of things. You asked the question, what's our definition of renewables? I prefer to talk about sustainability as opposed to renewables. I think we do need, in fact, to have an energy transformation. That transformation, I believe, needs to transform to an energy system that has a set of attributes, and those attributes include things like reliability, affordability, flexibility, adaptability, secure, safe, resilient, accessible. It needs to be clean in the sense that it is carbon neutral, or at least not contributing to global warming forcing functions. I think in that context, we've come a long ways. In the course of my now almost 4 decades of being in the alternative energy domain, we heard some of the numbers this morning, which I think were quite profound. 22% of global electricity is actually provided by renewable energy. Most of that is hydro. But we have 500 gigawatts of non-hydro renewables, which is quite dramatic. It's less than 7% of the overall generation. I think what will happen as we go forward is certainly under the IEA new policy scenario. Expectations is that may quadruple to maybe as much as 23, 24%. In terms of what can we achieve, what can we actually get? One of the things that my laboratory has been engaged in with a number of other institutions, Lawrence Berkeley Lab, the Pacific Northwest Lab, and MIT, we did a study a couple of years ago to look at how much renewable energy could you actually expect to have in the year 2050, should you desire to do so. And our conclusions were quite dramatic. Well, our conclusions were that in the U.S., in the year 2050, you can supply 80% of our energy demand and balance load and supply while keeping the grid stable on an hourly basis with 80% renewable resources. Now, that's not a prediction, it's not a projection, it's a what if. Can it happen? It would obviously require some things to be done differently. And those transformations would in fact, be required, I think, in terms of a variety of things, a much more flexible system. We've heard lots of the things today that I think are very, very important to do that. So it's but for our own, I think, desire that we can actually get to those kind of big outcomes. In terms of what might shape those policies that will allow us to get there, in the U.S., renewable portfolio standards at the state level have been the drivers. 47 gigawatts of deployment in renewable energy over the last 5 years have been due to state level policies, not federal. Federal is helping and they enable, but they don't drive. They drive at the local level going up. And that's an important thing. In fact, and that was done at a cost of not more than 1.8 cents per kilowatt hour on average across the nation. And that is built into the rate base. So there are policies that can work. Today we have 13% renewables from 13% electricity generation from renewables. 7% of that is non-hydro renewables, primarily wind and solar and geothermal and biofuels. So biomass rather. So it's very important in the U.S. that we keep a reliable grid. Our grid is 99.7% reliable, and we're not going to compromise on that. But you add to that the fact that we've got low-cost natural gas, and the real challenges for us are how do renewables compete in that environment. So the next big thing for us is systems integration. We heard a lot about that this morning. So I'll leave you with grid technology is really important, and that's kind of the next big thing that we're doing in the U.S. is pushing on the technologies that allow us to have a smart, flexible grid where distributed generation meets central station.
Fascinating. Thank you very much. Now, 80% figure is quite surprising even to hear it now. Okay, moving along, Mr. Tanaka, and interested to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. And I follow him what now Japan is doing. In fact, the Japanese government introduced a feed-in tariff system 2 years ago and expected the renewable deployment could be enormous. Yes, the plan or investment program is getting higher and higher. The problem is that utilities no longer can really deploy these renewables into the grid system because of the lack of connectivity in the grid in Japan, because they are controlled by the regional monopolies, and regional monopolies are not really connected very well. Even East Japan and West Japan has two separate frequency zones, 50 Hz, 60 Hz. So Japan is divided into two big markets. IEA, when I was executive director, we have been warning Japan, if this situation continues, Japan will be, let's say, shocked by some serious problem if something wrong happened, and it happened in March 2011. So this connectivity issue is a huge necessity to make the renewable deployment possible. Otherwise, simply utilities cannot buy. Even the feed-in tariff system introduce and let's say, give incentives for the investors to come along. It's very unfortunate. This kind of mistake has been long indicated and warned to the government, but unfortunately they didn't take it serious. It's now starting, finally, how to review the current system, how to make a reform of the power market, unbundling. So things is now starting. I hope that this will help for the facilitation of the renewables in the future. Another point which you mentioned, we mentioned in, let's say, this session or before that session at the Prime Minister Iswaran's statement, as well as the first session, regional integration or connectivity issue. Yes, European model of energy security and the sustainability is this interconnection beyond the borders. So certainly Germany can phase out nuclear power and move into the renewables because Germany in necessity can import electricity from France generated by nuclear in case of necessity, right? So this kind of connectivity certainly gives a good arbitrage of the frequently volatile renewables into the much more manageable system. So the larger the market of renewables, it's better to utilize more. So we lack in Japan this system, but European model should be a very good model for Europe, for not only for Europe, but Asia. ASEAN countries doing. So my strong advocacy is let's make it for Northeast Asia also. It's a growing area, including China, Korea, Japan, Russia, ASEAN countries, and maybe toward even India. This kind of Asian super grid, by the way, which is proposed by Masayoshi Son, the head of the SoftBank in Japan, is visionary, but I think this is the kind of direction Asian economy should follow to enhance sustainability as well as security. I will stop here, and if any kind of questions, I'm delighted to answer.
No, thank you very much, and I'd like to come back to you a bit more about how the European model might work in the Asian context. Thank you. Dr. Layton, be interested to hear from a New Zealand point of view.
Well, thank you. New Zealand's electricity generation is largely renewable already. In 2013, 3/4 of the electricity was generated by renewables, and we look at the fuel source is it a renewable and sustainable fuel source? So we include hydro, which made up about 55%, geothermal about 15%, wind about 5%, and we also have bioenergy fuel, including Lord Oxborough will be interested to know, ones that run on rubbish dumps and extract the methane gas from them. The renewables is growing as a source. In 2008 it was 65%, and in fact for 2014, we're nearing the end of the year, so the Electricity Authority staff have sent me a projection that in 2014 it will be 80% will be renewables. New Zealand's approach is to let the market determine both the choice of generation that's invested in and to let the market determine which is the generation that will be running at any particular point in time. There is a government energy policy that has a target of 90% renewables in electricity by 2025. That was set when we were at 65%, but it's an aspirational target, and no one, not even the Electricity Authority, is required or obliged to ensure it happens. In fact, the Electricity Authority is required under its Act to promote competition in, reliable supply by, and the efficient operation of the electricity industry. And it's interpreted this to mean it should not be promoting any particular form of generation relative to any other, but should be ensuring that all forms are able to be competing on a level playing field. We are independent of the government. In terms of the government energy policy statement, the board of the Electricity Authority is required to have regard to it, but not to give effect to it. And there are court decisions which say have regard to it means we have to read it and think about it when we come to making decisions, but we're not responsible for bringing in place any of those policies. Indeed, what we will be held to task for is ensuring that whatever we do is efficient, and deliberately setting off subsidies such as feed-in tariffs would fail that test pretty quickly, in my view. So we have a very market approach to it. We have complete retail competition. We have open entry into generation. The monopoly elements are regulated for some of them, but some others are merely regulated by information disclosure. And those monopoly elements are, of course, the distribution and transmission charges. We now have 73 generation companies that we've identified, and we have 14 retail brands, and 14 retailers and 25 retail brands that we're aware of. There's no price cap in the wholesale market, so prices can reflect scarcity. There's no rules about the provision of reserves, but reserves are co-optimised with offers for energy, so that it's the combined minimisation of the cost of delivered energy and reserves. And there is also charges for frequency keeping, which is a market. We have a market for black start, as well as that market for reserves. The other factor that you should be aware of that's important in this context is that New Zealand actually has an all gases, all sectors emissions trading scheme, and has had such since 2008. There are provisions which have the rural sector where the gas is methane out of burping and flatulent cows that are in place, but the significance of that is that when people are looking at what generation to invest in or to plan, they are knowing that they are subject, even now, to emissions charges. At the moment, of course, emissions charges on the world market are low, but they know that if that should change, the scheme is already there, that they will actually pay it. And for that reason, we actually have currently consented in New Zealand new renewable generation capacity that equates to 3,440 megawatts, which by some countries is not much, but the total capacity in New Zealand is only 10,000 megawatts, so it's roughly equivalent as a third waiting consented to be able to be built. And the total non-renewables at the moment is 2,500 megawatts of capacity, so there's more already consented waiting to be changed.
Thank you very much, Dr. Layton. Moving along now to Lord Mogg, President of the Council of European Energy Regulators. Be interested in your comments from a European perspective.
Thank you, Chairman, and for the opportunity of talking. I'll take an immediate position not to answer the question exactly, except to say that in Europe, and I hope in most countries, regulators are there to implement government policy. Government is there to implement its policy, including those targets that were much criticised during the course of today. So regulators in Europe are there to implement and hopefully to deliver and advise on the orientation set by ministers. I think for that reason, my comments are directed more at the experience that we're having to integrate renewable energy from the perspective of what governments cannot do and maybe regulators can. I think it's quite clear that for sustainability reasons and for to meet those emission targets, renewable energy sources are here and in many places very big. The range in Europe goes from just under half in Sweden down to third and below. 3% is the UK's fine performance. So we have set out as regulators in Europe in a document that I would tentatively recommend. It's called the Bridge to 2025, which is after a year's extensive consultation, our views on how the markets will move, technology will move in gas, electricity, renewable energy. And the conclusions that we've drawn, some of these I'll make today. So I have 4 brief points and a final thought. First, the task of regulators is to move away obstacles to connections and to speed up the possibility of those connections. Singapore Minister that mentioned this morning a week, which is extraordinarily good. Also, it is, in the case of the agency that we've established in Europe, to resolve cross-border disputes, which are rare between regulators over interconnections infrastructure. But sometimes, as we talk about some of the interconnections, you may well need that sort of resolution mechanism. Perhaps the greatest challenge in this area is the second, which is the integration of the non-programmable renewable energy sources into the grid. That has so many aspects that the rest of the time could be taken, but it's quite clear. First, there will be many new business models. And I think probably the most significant change is going to be in the DSO configurations. It's quite clear that they are going to play an increasing part which might challenge their neutrality in the market, and therefore there may need to be a look at the possible competition aspects. As regulators, we can incentivize those changes, the DSOs to make such changes. We can also monitor that they are not so costly, because from our point of view, the independent regulator in Europe is there to be consumer-centric and look after the interests of consumer. So, looking for market possible abuses. Also, we see a much greater collaboration between the DSO and TSO, a need for that collaboration, partly because connections can be at distribution or transmission levels, and partly because the new smart arrangements will allow such an action. And an important point, I think, in this area is that there are new kids on the block, or there should be, and incumbents should not restrict their access. But I'm not talking only about energy companies. I think one of the aspects that we all need to recognise is that, and I shall say a word at the end about this, that companies such as Google are not trying to take over the energy company's role, but rather to contribute towards the huge masses of data that will be produced, and in terms of harvesting the benefits for that. My third point is that a crucial aspect is that because of the non-programmability of the renewable energy support, some flexible and rapid response is necessary. This will come from gas-fired generation, which is very expensive, particularly as it ramps up intermittently. But that we see as the demand-side response. I think Singapore does too, and this is recognised. We have already decided to review the market solutions which will value flexibility. At the present time, there is minimal value for flexibility. It's only supply of energy. Within the existing markets, who knows, maybe there will be a specific market on valuing flexibility. And in that is an important point which I think I haven't heard very often mentioned in the course of today's excellent meeting, the role of the consumer in this. It is not only a consumer who is a prosumer, but a consumer who is the centric figure. And we in Europe think that there needs to be much greater empowerment of consumers, involvement in policies, and in protection. My fourth point is on financing. There is a key play role, already mentioned by our first speaker, Dr. Birchbaum, who said, stable regulatory arrangements attract investment, here. And that is the basis. Investment will be needed. Given the inefficiencies of the Europe CTS arrangements, the introduction of subsidies that have taken place, the range is astonishing, from 12 euro cents to over 20 euros. Regulators have reviewed this and have made recommendations and have provided the data to the policymakers, and there is some grip coming, and I think that will be the future. So my final remark, Chair. I think that we all need to talk much more to people who are outside the energy loop. And I say that to myself as a regulator. We need to talk, and these are the ones that I've identified: the water regulator, the telecoms regulator, the data privacy regulator, cybersecurity, whatever they are, regulator or whatever, transportation. There's 5. I think that's something that in the city-state of Singapore, you talk very well to everybody, but I can only say we should imitate you.
Thank you very much, Lord Milk. And interestingly, your points on flexibility, quite often we try and talk about some of these energy sources in isolation, but of course we can't. Without moving on to Dr. Chiang Liu, Secretary General of the Global Forum on Energy Security, be interested in your comments. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Tim, and thanks to EMA. I'm so happy to be here and discuss the Chinese progress on renewables energies. At first, I would like to introduce our Global Forum on Energy Security. Mr. Guy Lufter and his Institute for the Analysis of Global Security and our institute are coordinating the Forum on Energy Security, Global Energy Security. In 2013, China energy consumption was about 2,800 million TOE, and the growth rate is about 3.7%, in which wind power contributed about 1.3%, and natural gas contributed 5.8%. Hydropower contributed about 8%, and nuclear contributed about maybe 1%. But however, many people would think in China, the renewables energies is occupied so little the share. What's the role of the renewables to enhance your your energy security? But I would like to say that in China, the renewables have made a big progress, such as the wind power has created a miracle. Now China has the biggest capacity. China has built 9 super wind power bases from east and west in Mongolia and some other provinces. In 2012, wind power, we met some problems because in China, the energy business are very far from the center of the consumption. It's the same case in the wind power. So we have to waste much of the wind power. This case improved in the last year. And we still have another very fun things in the renewables development, such as the biomass energy. Many biomass energy companies may sign contracts with the farmer to collect their biomass, but the contract was signed in the spring or summer, but when they collect the biomass in the autumn, the farmers always say, oh no, we need a higher price. You need to pay a higher price to us. So I think there's some obstacles in the development of the renewables. And another problem is the grid connection. As I just mentioned, some wind power plants are very far from the center of the consumption, so we need to build a grid or some connection lines to transmit the power from very far distance to maybe Shanghai or some other cities. Some distance may about 2,000 miles or even longer. But I think that in China we have already recognized these problems. The newest progress is that we think about we should change the models to build renewable projects. The one most important thing is that we have decided to develop distributed energy systems that can combine the wind power and solar power, PV power, and biomass power stations with another, such as the natural gas power stations, together very well. And it is very near the center of the consumption. We also promote the development of the wind power during the tidal areas and near the coastal provincials. And we would also like to do some better relationships among different stakeholders for renewables and traditional energy industries, and to explore new models for the market structure, and the MO Ministry of the Finance would like to support some projects like this one. But I would like to mention that in nowadays, sorry, I will find some data. About our detailed information, China is confronting a substantial changing of the energy supply and demand. This year's economic growth dropped to around 7.4%, which will be the lowest since 1990. I think this will be a normal rate in the future of Chinese economy. I think that may be a good thing to our world, because in many years before, many foreigner friends talked to me, said they worry about the growth rate of the China's energy demand. They will say, oh, you need more and more energy. You will buy more and more gas, natural gas, crude oil from Middle East, from all of the exporter countries. What the hell you will, when will you get the peak? I would think this is the time for China's economy. Maybe the peak is coming. And this judgment, I think, is based on the termination of the urbanization and the industrialization process in China. And once the demand of the super-scale infrastructure and the real estate construction will vanish gradually. If it reduced, I think the Chinese will have a better perspectives of the energy supply. So in this process, I think we can have another advantage to utilize the renewables, because we have to reduce our consumption of the coal sources. We can reduce the coal, and we can use more and more renewables. I think that's a good thing to us and to the world. And I think we can do it better.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think fascinating story so far, and more to evolve, so very interesting. Mr. Saidi, Mozambique, renewables is not the first thing that springs to mind when you think about Mozambique, but perhaps you can enlighten us.
Thank you, Tim, our moderator. Well, it's always a very interesting subject to talk about renewable energy. I'll just turn to the Mozambique context. I would say that for a country with our economy and a huge potential of renewable, we are blessed for renewable energy sources. We have solar, wind, hydro, ocean. We have a coastline of 2,800 kilometers of coastline, geothermal, because it's one of the countries that the Rift Valley come through. So we have almost all the different sources of renewable energy. But then when we realize that really we have been blessed of all these resources, we had to stop and see how to go about this. Because all the world we have been talking about renewable, how to do that. Because we have non-conventional sources and conventional sources. We have plenty of natural gas, as you have known. We have coal, and big hydro we do also have in our country. So it's challenging to talk about all other renewable sources in a country like this. But then our vision as a country, we look at some very priorities, like to increase access to modern energy, looking to diversify the sources of energy, not just rely on some of them, and energy security. If I can just give you some figure, At the moment, only 40% of the total population has access to electricity. 26% comes from the main grid, the green connected people, and 14 comes for off-grid systems. That challenged us, and we had to think about how really to conduct the process. What are our vision in terms of go further on responding to the challenges on energy side? So as a government, we have defined that we should really look into the policy and strategy framework and then move to the regulatory framework in order to allow the renewable energy to come into force. So in the country, we have really a lot of experience on renewable energy, different experience on renewable energy, on the solar, on the hydro, some on the biomass, but we need really to come all that together. That's why the government has to define a vision on the renewable energy, and we have approved the policy on renewable, the strategy on renewable, and we are doing the different regulatory framework that allows renewable to come into force and to allow to bring the private sector to the game. Well, because up to now, according to what we have been developing in the country, most of the investment that we have been carrying out in the country are basically public investment. But we have to shift this situation that we have. We have to make a transition from a pure public investment to PPPs, public-private partnerships, in order to really have in the near future a private investment on renewable energy. But that then, it calls up attention that we need to have the regulatory framework on the ground that can attract the private sector to come into the board. So learning on that process and looking around, we have visited several countries in Europe to understand how they have really handled this process in order to trying to get the right way to go on our policy in the country. And we have designed our strategic framework, which guide us to, first of all, to understand what we have available in the country, how much we have, where, in order to allow us to define the priorities and to make the right plans in order to complement the conventional and the non-conventional source together in the same to respond to the challenge that we have. So we have done so far the renewable atlas in the country. We have the data for the different sources of renewable. You know where, how much, and we have estimated costs for the different sites that we have in order to allow the private sector to come to the process. At the same time, we try to bring to the country the technology development. We have now factories of solar PV in order to allow the technologies to be more available to the people and to allow people to develop that. We have been carrying out some electrification in the different sites of the country, whereby I have to mention that we have like 177 villages that have been powered by renewable systems, solar, PV, and small hydro. So these are some contributions that we have from on the ground. So being that we have defined that we should really try to bring into the boat the private sector, so the government related to that has approved the refit for the country. But learning from the experience that the world has on the refit, we had to define that we should put ceilings on the capacity, how much we should develop, because that means that we have to pay attention on the infrastructure that we have available in the country in order to absorb the renewables. As you know, all of us, that there is intermittence on the renewable. Some of the renewable has intermittence. You have really be able to handle that on the integration to the grid. So we had to define that and put some ceilings in order to allow it. So on our refit, we are considering 4 options: hydro, small hydro, solar, wind, and the biomass. And that's due to the fact that we have some experience in the country that we want really to systematize all those and trying to bring to the share of renewable in the country. So at this stage, our big challenge is really to establish all the platform that will allow the private sector to come in, because it will really bring the market and allow really the boost of renewable in Mozambique. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, and really interesting stats there in terms of the number of your population who've got access to electricity currently. Very good. Dr. Gielen, be very interested to hear from IRENA point of view. I know you've been doing some studies recently, and you sent me through some very interesting information on your REMAP project, but perhaps you could give us your remarks on that and the technology side of things.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, it started out with the United Nations Secretary General calling for a doubling of the global renewable energy share by 2030. It's part of what's called the Sustainable Energy for All initiative. 2010, the world had 18% renewables. So doubling, 36% by 2030. Now that was very much a political target. So our member countries, they wanted to know, well, is that really possible? And what would it imply in terms of cost, in terms of distribution of efforts, etc. So we analyzed the 26 largest economies together with the experts from these countries. So, for example, NREL input was very valuable in that. And there were a number of important conclusions. If we aggregated these results, business as usual, policies in place, take us only from 18 to 21%. So a big gap with that doubling. We found that a doubling is technically possible, and we found, in fact, that it also makes economic sense. There is additional cost in the order of 130 billion a year, but at the same time, there is significantly reduced external effects, health effects, and greenhouse gas emissions, up to 600 billion per year. So benefits far exceed the cost. From a government perspective, I should say. Business perspective is something different. So there is a need to bring the business perspective in line with that government perspective, to give the right market signals. We also found that while renewables, most of the time when we talk renewables, we talk immediately about power generation. We found that 40% of the potential is indeed in power generation, but 60% is in the end-use sectors, buildings, industry, transport. So if you really want to accelerate renewables, you need to broaden your horizon and also look in the end-use sectors. And we also found that there are some important synergies between energy efficiency and renewable energy. So certain options, say, for example, heat pumps, have an important efficiency benefit, but at the same time, they allow more use of renewables in power generation. We come with a number of recommendations. So first of all, we find that there is still a lot of misunderstandings about renewables. For example, the data on the potentials are not well known, and even they change quickly. If you look, for example, at wind, the wind potential has increased by an order of magnitude over the last decade, not because there is more wind, but because we can better measure where the wind is and we can build much larger wind turbines. There's still a lot of people arguing, and I also heard it here this morning, that renewables are too expensive. I have a serious problem with that type of generic statements. There are now many cases, many instances where renewables is by far the cheapest option. So getting these cost data right is very important, and updating them continually. And having local cost data. You cannot use cost data from one project and say, okay, that applies globally. Then enabling infrastructure. We talked a lot here about the need for example, interconnectors that will enable to deal better with variability, but also that will allow to tap into remote resources. For example, we're doing that now in what we call the Africa Clean Energy Corridor. So the idea is to use remote, high-quality renewables resources and link them to the centers of demand, which are often in other countries. Enabling infrastructure is not only about power generation, there's also a big issue for biomass. So biomass is a little bit more complex than all the other renewables because you need to get the feedstock. And you need to get the feedstock at an affordable price. And so how to organize that is a key issue for global renewables. Policy frameworks was mentioned, is very important, but it's not only about designing enabling policy framework, but also enforcing them. There are far too many countries where the text is good, but the implementation is lacking. We're getting a lot of questions on renewables, not so much from the energy policy perspective, but much more from a general development perspective. So how can you create jobs? How can you create new economic activity with renewables? So that is, I think, a perspective that perhaps also here in the region could be stressed more. Malaysia, Indonesia were part of this analysis. Together with IEEJ, we're working on Southeast Asia analysis as part of REMAP that's ongoing. Last week, we had renewables readiness assessment, a mission to the Philippines, where we found that capacity building, energy planning, and long-term strategy development and deployment were areas where renewables uptake could be accelerated, through which renewables could be accelerated. And then Singapore, we have the island lighthouses. Singapore is one of the small island development states, perhaps not very well known. And that's a grouping that has called for much higher shares of renewables when they met last month in Samoa. So Southeast Asia is, say, from my perspective, a little bit lagging. More could be done if you compare it with other countries and other regions. And there is a great opportunity to leapfrog and to learn from others and do it right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who's been sending in their questions. If there is a question from the floor, raise your hand, but I'm going to read out a question from here first of all. But if anyone has got a question, please raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. Can't see any hands going up. Okay. There's two interesting questions here. One is, given the growing prevalence of distributed energy, how should grid operators change their business models and charging mechanisms to ensure cost recovery while each customer pays their fair share? There's also another question asking about solar energy and saying solar energy is highly intermittent and this puts more stress on the system. How should we ensure that intermittent sources pay their fair share of cost to handle such intermittency? Mm-hmm. So two questions there in terms of like who pays. I'd quite like in the last 5 minutes to really sort of focus on some of the hows. I mean, going back to your original point there about you predict that, or you're saying that by 2050, 80% is possible. And Mr. Tanaka, you mentioned that there's lots of lessons to be learnt from the European system. Perhaps we could sort of, just as part of the wrap-up, talk about how do you get to the 80%, and then maybe kind of, what would work in this region, whether it's a European model or if people have got other questions. And we can also, I think, Dr. Layton talk about the who pays from a New Zealand experience. So perhaps from the 80%, how is that made up?
Sure. I think a couple of things that I think in all the comments were, I think, exceptionally valuable. We need to look at the whole system differently. We have right now a system that essentially has electron flow in one direction, at least for the utility of electricity. And we need to think about energy as a service, not as electrons or, for that matter, in transport molecules. And we need to, some people like to use the word disintermediation, which essentially is let's think about energy from the perspective of what service it provides, and then let's value those services in a way that the system actually accommodates for that. So if you are a consumer that's producing, you may actually provide ancillary services into the grid, and you ought to get paid for those ancillary services. At the same time, there's grid stability things that are happening behind the meter at the central station, and they need to be compensated as well. So if we turn our business model on its edge, if you will, you can begin to think about a new approach to how you value those services. And you have to have, it's a complex system. It's very digitally, information intensive. You're measuring, you're controlling, and you are developing new business models that allow you to value the services that you provide in a very different way than we do it today. And it will have to start small. This is not something where you completely revamp the system entirely, but you have to start somewhere, and I think it really is an important part of the evolution of the system. So looking at it differently, it means all the stakeholders have to come together and understand how they are going to benefit from this transformation.
Thanks. So,
Yeah. About the targets of the renewables, it doesn't make any sense of setting the targets as such. 30%, 40%, 20%, 80% of the renewable. It should be considered as a whole set of mix of the energy. Otherwise, each country has a different geographical situation and capacities and resources, so it's not easy as such. So for UN, doubling the renewable target, Dolph said about this doubling numbers, but the target must be how to increase the energy access or alleviate energy poverty issues, or how to give them modern cooking devices. This kind of thing is a target. Rather than setting the targets of renewables, not make much sense. For Japan, I think some speakers said about this flexibility of the system. This is huge importance. There's some study in the IEA. If some arrangement of increasing flexibility in the system by the grid connection, demand control, supply cuts, or storage, or more better forecasting, etc. So the cost of adding more renewables could be substantially reducible, from 40%, for example, to 10 to 15% increase. This is much, very, very, interesting point we have to say. And also, in terms of the whole energy mix, nuclear and carbon with CCS should not be eliminated from the financial support or CDM or offsetting mechanism, whatever. Because if we try to aim at energy security and sustainability, these technologies should not be minimized. They are a very important other way of doing the targets, what we mean, the goals. So yes, there's some discussion of the nuclear technology. I want to say that small modular reactor is fine, but small modular fast reactor is now in need for the developed country like Japan or Korea or United States, because nuclear problem is not only the safety. This issue of the high-level waste or proliferation risk, we have to search of the future technologies to solve these other problems. And without these, we cannot have the future of the nuclear. So kind of technological breakthrough is needed. And I think, let's think whole set of the diversity in energy. That is a way to enhance energy security.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Layton, from the New Zealand experience and taking some of the questions that have come through on the Pigeonhole, kind of who pays and how do you kind of get the balance right?
Yes, well, they're interesting questions, actually. I'll deal with the photovoltaic one and the intermittent renewables first. New Zealand does not have a great deal of photovoltaics. We don't have feed-in tariffs, and the economics at the moment are that it's getting closer, but it's not quite there. For most people, there are circumstances where it is. So we have a growing component of it, but it's not much. But we do have wind, which is significant, and it's intermittent too. Some studies were done about 4 or 5 years ago about the impact on reserves that we would require that said that we could probably cater, because we have a largely hydro base load, which is pretty easily flexed, that we could cater with up to 20% of wind without having to deal with reserves. Frequency keeping is a different issue. At the moment with 5%, it's the assessment done by the predecessor to the Electricity Authority was it wasn't yet time to consider that. They had a work program. We, as an Electricity Authority, put it on hold, but we'll renew it on how we actually charge, and people know that we will it's sitting there and it will be addressed. But at the moment, the costs and benefits of doing that mean that it's not a regulatory priority. But it is actually working out what your incremental cost is. But to shift to the other one, and that's about charges for lines and distribution that somebody raised, that's something that we also face. We realise we have a heritage that the line companies were also the retailers, so that many of them still charge largely on the energy throughput, where with photovoltaics, they're going to be no longer providing an energy service, they're going to be providing a backup service, a capacity service for a lot of it. And so if they just remain charging on the energy, there is going to be an issue for their revenue. I started about nearly 2 years ago talking to stakeholders about that issue coming down the track. We conducted, as an authority, a review of the pricing of distribution companies relative to our pricing principles, which are about efficiency. We've reported all those results to everybody. We've held meetings with key stakeholders again, started to talk in the media about the issue, and very interesting, in the last month, the companies themselves are starting to talk about it. We see that we've already had Auckland, which is the biggest city, and Wellington, which after Christchurch got slashed with an earthquake, became the second biggest city, have both changed their pricing structures. So I think it will happen, and probably in time for photovoltaics, but it is an issue.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a question from the audience there. Any more questions while the mic's coming? Okay, There's one more question here. We'll take two questions, one after the other.
My name is Bat Haj, University of Southampton, UK. The question I want to ask is related to the topic of the session, which is about the integration of renewables into the current grid. Most of the issues that we are encountering, especially in the UK, is the availability of the grid. And that also creates a burden on developers who tend to be very small companies. And that burden is not the same as the burden that's given to fossil fuel type generation. And as people realize early on, the session that we had before is about subsidies, and fossil fuel subsidies are about 553 billion in 2012 compared to 40 billion for renewables 553 billion for fossils and 43 for renewables. I really cannot see why the difficulty here, if there is a good playing field in relation to renewables, especially in microgrids for developing countries, that we should really just go into fossil fuels only. We should have a mix and we should have it balanced. We also need to have access to energy across the world. Thank you.
Thank you. And there was another question here which we'll take after that.
Hi, my name is Philip Wynne from Prodegia. I'm a management consultant for utilities and infrastructure. My question is, where do you see in the next 3 years in the region the private sector playing a key role in developing renewables? We have understood that there's huge needs. Private sector could help to accelerate those needs in the region. How and where do you see it happening? Thank you.
Thank you. So I think kind of a question there about UK experience and the role of the private sector. I mean, it comes from something we were discussing earlier, I think, as well. But if these renewable targets aren't met, who's to blame? Is it the regulator? Is it the private sector? Is it the consumer?
Well, I think the private sector, I'm glad you asked me that question rather than the first question. I couldn't really hear it. The private sector has a fundamental role in all aspects of the market. I mean, I think most of the liberalised market looks to the private sector, where I think the regulator's role is to incentivise behaviour and actions, and government's role is to set targets. But I think there's another aspect that is less, it's inevitable, I think, that the companies would develop networks, will develop responses, will develop flexibility. In a liberalised market, we're already seeing this happen. I'm very confident about that. I think an aspect that I haven't seen the private sector develop, and I think which will be crucial in the acceptance of renewables, is in educating the consumer. In Europe as a whole, we have very poor success rates in switching from one supplier to another. Part of that is to do with educating, in the broader sense, consumers that it pays to switch, if it usually does. And part of that responsibility rests with the companies, not only the market arrangements, but the companies. I use that as an example. I think increasingly it's quite clear that consumers do not realise what they can save by energy efficiency actions, by the automation, by the introduction of automated systems, by energy services more generally. And I think provided the market is sufficiently flexible, provided there is sufficient regulation, companies can and indeed should fill in all the niches, the opportunities in terms of market development, such as energy services, whilst providing low-cost provision of services. And that's where we as regulators need to make sure that we are getting cost-benefit arrangements. I would be very confident, I must say, if I may, in relation to Singapore, that Singapore, because of an educated population and because of a very effective interrelationship between the services and this, as the Minister said at the beginning, this tremendous step change down from regulated prices down to the announcement today of down to the last 20% non-regulated prices. I would be very encouraged to think that the adaptation can happen here as well as anywhere in the world.
Thank you. I feel like I'm in a bit of a time warp here because the clock did reset itself, but we've got less than 2 minutes left. I mean, just quick, I don't know if anybody's got any kind of final points, but does anybody want to actually say from the panel what they would recommend Singapore's role in this is, in terms of getting renewables into the energy system? If anybody's dying to comment?
I would have a very simple 3 words: go for it. I think you're already going for it. I think that government is clearly leading. I think the argument about whether renewables should happen, the balance between fossil fuels and so on, ignores one important fact. Governments are there to define what policy should be, and governments have around the world, in many places, set the target of increasing the level of renewables. And therefore, I think in Singapore's case, there's a clear governmental lead, an independent fairly independent regulator, and an active, educated market both in terms of consumers and companies. So go for it.
Okay, any more three-word comments?
Slightly more than three, but Singapore is an open, market-oriented economy, and I think they should maintain that approach when dealing with renewables as well. Try and use market instruments. So it's essentially the same message as Lord Mog.
Yeah, I think certainly Singapore needs to be an active participant. These are global markets. They will transform. Singapore's ability to be able to participate in those markets and create opportunities for innovation are enormous, and they can't not participate. So I agree with let's go for it.
Okay.
Yes, well, to make the private sector work predictable or more stable, policy framework is necessary, and everybody knows that, but government very often change it. So, energy infrastructure takes long years. So without, this kind of change always creating huge problems. So the commitment of the government for predictable future, the long-term stable policy is probably most important.
Thank you very much. I think those three words ringing in our ears, go for it. We'll probably be told to go for it right now. I do say, but thank you very much for your attention, and we'll wrap up the session there. Thank you very much.